Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Legendarium podcast. Today is an Author Shelf episode. If you recall, the Author Shelf is where we bring an author onto the show, and in order to get to know them a little bit better, instead of your standard interview, we actually ask them to pull a book off of their shelves, something that is important to them, that has been influential in some way in their life, in their career, whatever the case may be. So that's what we're doing today. I am your host, Craig Hanks, and with me today, we've got, well, somebody whose ideas are so odious, I think the only way to get him off of our backs is to gift him a moon and send him there. It's Ryan Bruckman.
Oh, I know what I'm getting for Christmas this year.
Wouldn't that be awesome? And, I hear that she's really close to cracking Ansible communication technology, and if only we didn't have to steal her away for an hour, I'm sure she could get it done this morning. It's Mary Robinette Kowal.
Hello. I'm happy to be here. And time is mutable, so I can just work on that at any point along that linear timeline.
You already have. You
That's correct.
You're always working on it. Yeah, absolutely. Hey everybody, Craig here. I apologize, we're missing a chunk of this particular audio, which is really too bad because right at the beginning of the episode is when I ask the author coming onto Author Shelf, why did you pick this book? And Mary Robinette had some great things to say about how this book made her think about what it means to live in a dystopia or utopian society, and it was all very interesting, trust me. But unfortunately, you'll never hear it. The audio got lost in the upload process because we were recording online, and she was on hotel Wi-Fi, and you know how it goes. But the interview did pick up a few minutes later, and so we do have the rest of it. There's one more break. Hopefully I can edit it somewhat seamlessly so you don't notice the other one. But this one was large enough that I thought I might come in and just say, sorry. Sorry to you, the listeners. Sorry to Mary Robinette that we are missing that audio. But the rest of the conversation is too good not to put it out there. So here we go. Let's get to the rest of it. Let's see. Is it going? Yeah, it seems to be. All right, Ryan, I wanted to ask you next, basically just the basic question. How did it go for you? Is this your first Le Guin? Did you do any Le Guin with us earlier in the podcast?
I genuinely couldn't remember because I was familiar with some of Le Guin's work, specifically Wizard of Earthsea is the very common entry point. And I know I've had discussions about Wizard of Earthsea. So I feel like I've read it, but I couldn't recall enough of it. So I'm just going to treat this as my first. Yeah, it may not actually be, but I will treat it as my first here. And it's a different writing style, a different feel than what I'm used to, just considering a lot of what we read sits in the more modern, common, epic fantasy things, the Sandersons, the things like that. So that's, this had a different feel and required a different approach for me to truly try and appreciate and understand it, because it just has, it sits at a little bit less of I'll say a little bit slower pace going through than a lot of things that are more cinematic.
I'd say that's fair.
Yeah.
It reminds me, actually, as you say that, it reminds me of when we first read Robin Hobb. Yeah. And I hated that first book. I couldn't stand it. And then I realized the reason I couldn't stand it was because my expectations were something very different. Yeah. And then she brought in something I was not expecting. And I hadn't been prepped for it. I didn't do any, outside reading before the book and all that. And so it was so jarring. The analogy I use a lot is it's when you pick up a glass of Sprite, but then it turns out it's water. There's nothing wrong with water, but you still gag because it's so unexpected. And then you're like, oh no, it's just water. Oh no, this is great. Okay, great. So it's a bit like that. Anyway, is that I guess what I'm getting at is this book is one of those ones where you've got to have certain expectations going in, or you might instinctively gag, and before realizing, oh, okay, all right, it's just a different type of
potentially. It's very contemplative.
Yeah, it's one where I know, especially going through the beginning, reading that for the first probably, I mean, we're getting through his history in his youth through that sequence. I'm sitting here kind of going, all right. Well, I'm waiting for the shoe to drop. I'm waiting for things to happen. And it's not really about progressing the exciting plot point. It's about these conversations he's having. It's a series of vignettes of his past, things like that, especially in the early book, where it's here's where he's getting his viewpoints, and it's learning about what's made him who he is, to the point where he is traveling to try and consider bringing these two worlds together. Is that going to be possible? And this is why I didn't fit here in my home on the moon, in my home planet here. And I'm not going to really fit here because I'm from there and I've got a lot of that, but I don't. So it really isolates him, puts him on the island. And the only way you get that is by understanding these vignettes in there. And that's not a modern tactic in writing.
At least not commonly. Yeah.
At least, not commonly. So,
yeah. Mary Robinette, you said something interesting, which was you said something along the lines of, I realized I live in the utopia, and that there are other things out there. There is, I've seen a subtitle for this book that I haven't actually seen on the book, but you see it online in certain places, an ambiguous utopian novel or something like that. So my question for you is, what do you think that means? What is the utopia? Are there multiple utopias? What do we make of that concept?
Yeah, I think that is, it's one of the pieces that's so meaty about it, because, is Antares the utopia? Because it's this collective.
That's the anarchist moon, right?
The anarchist moon. Is the anarchist moon the utopia because it's this collective? They don't have a lot, but everybody cooperates. Or is the utopia the planet where they have all of the wealth and, and can have this enormous luxury? And the answer, depending on who your POV character is, both, depending on what they value. And I love that. And then the other piece of it that I also love that she's just kind of drawing this quiet line under is that with the main planet in particular, that utopia does not exist without a servant class, without people to take wealth from, and it's just this undercurrent that makes you think about property and possessions. And I sound very much like, everybody give all of your things away. And it's not that so much as like, think about it, do it mindfully, be aware of where things are coming from.
No, it's what you were saying at the very beginning, which was, I live in a certain type of society, but this isn't the only type of thing that exists, and being aware of something outside of your immediate sphere is valuable, right? As I was reading through the book, I was reminded of something I learned in the last 5 years or so, which is that the word utopia is actually the wrong word. We're using the wrong word. If we're actually using the real Greek, it would start with an E. And a utopia with an E at the beginning would be good place. But a utopia without the E, just utopia, means no place, as in it cannot exist. It's not a thing that can be real. And I kept thinking about that as I was reading through this book. It was driving me crazy for the first, say, quarter of the book as I'm reading about these anarchists. And then he goes to the surface of the planet with all the capitalists, and everything was so cranked up to 11 that it kind of made me feel like she was playing around with this idea of the no E utopia, the no place, where it's like, I'm just going to crank it up and see what happens. It's like a villain who is, the mustache twirling villain, where, real people don't think and act and talk this way, but for the purposes of the story, we're going to crank this villain up to 11. And I felt that way about kind of these societies, just for illustrative purposes. We're going to crank that dial all the way up, and see what happens. But it took me a while to realize that was what was going on, because I was like, no society could last this way for this long without collapsing, in either direction. They're so extreme.
Yeah, and at the same time, it's if you it is so much about the perception of the character. Because if you've done any travel outside of the U.S., when you return, your perceptions of what's going on here. Like I spent a month in Bihar, India, which is the poorest state in India, and we were out in rural Bihar, so places without running water, without electricity, and this was, and I should also say, this was in the late 90s that I was there. But one of the things that struck me when I came back was specifically was we came back to Calcutta, and we went to this hotel, and it was like one of those old grand colonial hotels with incredibly tall ceilings. And after a month of either concrete or dirt floors, I walk in, I'm like, oh my goodness, it's so luxurious. Look at all of these things. And over the next 3 days that we were there, the lens kept dropping off. And I'm like, and it's really shabby and run down, and the carpet is totally worn. And if I were staying here in the US, I would be like, oh my God, have they ever cleaned this? These, these British people are clinging on to stuff. And then when I got back to the US, someone put down a glass of water, and I had this simultaneous reaction of, oh, thank heavens, and to be in a place where I don't have to think about it. And also, that water is not safe.
Right.
And, it's all of these small things that we take for granted that can seem like it's cranked up to 11, but if it's stuff that you've never experienced, of course it's going to seem over the top. Of course it's going to seem huge, but at the same time, some of the parties that he was going to, like those, you watch TikTok, and some of those parties are not, they're not an exaggeration.
Thank goodness Ursula Le Guin never had to experience TikTok.
Let's
be grateful for that.
God, she would have devastated people if she were on TikTok. Sorry, I'm just going to live
you
in
look
that
like
little
you had some
world.
responses.
It's funny you mentioned that, because that's actually, she makes a point of that in the book in one moment where they're talking about, I think the quote, you need distance interval. The way to see how beautiful the earth is to see it as the moon. The way to see how beautiful life is from the vantage point of death. It's literally the idea that you have to be able to separate yourself and have the point of view and perspective of, like your example where you were in Bihar, and then how everything grows from there, where our point of view normally puts us in a place where, like, well, yeah, that's clearly crazy, but others would be like, no, that's the reality. And I think that is a very powerful thing to realize for people, especially today, is just to be able to look at it and realize that where you stand in your point of view and your perspective right now is inherently affected by your current environment and your current setup. And the more you can do to get out and figure out what other perspectives are and understand that, whether that be through travel or, just understanding in any capacity, it's going to give you put you in a better position to understand what some of these pieces, like, how extreme this seems, or maybe I live in a little more, maybe I'm closer to a utopia than I thought, or, whatever.
Yeah.
So Ryan, you reminded me, I kind of wanted to ask, I mean, I've got some myself, but for the two of you, do you have any favorite kind of lines or moments? The writing in this that's my favorite part. Le Guin is quite the prose stylist, and she had a few moments. I'll give you one of mine. I've got a couple, but I'll give you one of mine, and then if you have any, I'll be happy to hear them. Let's see. This is way back. I mean, in chapter 1, or even, I don't remember if it's prologue, honestly. But he had always feared that this would happen more than he had even ever feared death. To die is to lose the self. Oh no, I'm sorry. No, I'm reading the wrong thing. This is terrible. There it is. There it is. There it is. His eyes saved him. What they insisted on seeing and reporting to him took him out of the autism of terror.
Ooh.
And I was like, oh my gosh, the autism of terror. Wow. And it made me go and look up the word autism, because we have our understanding of what autism is. And it's, but the definition of the word is just kind of this inability to communicate and speak normally, and normally, whatever that means.
Yeah.
And but the autism of terror, I was like, oh my gosh, that's excellent. What a great line.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, no. Just, what you said. She's such a good prose stylist. And also remembering the book was written in 1974. I did think about suggesting something written in the 21st century, but also I feel like everybody should read The Dispossessed. For me, it again, when we talk about work that has influenced the way I approach the world, there's a line in there. You can't crush ideas by suppressing them. You can only crush them by ignoring them, by refusing to think, refusing to change. And I'm like, that for me is such a powerful thing. It's like, it is, it is incumbent on me to engage with ideas, even if they're ideas that I am uncomfortable with. That if I want to see things change, I have to engage with stuff. And then the stuff that I don't want to, if there's a troll, or if there's somebody else that's coming at me, or coming at somebody else, if I want to crush their idea, this is one of those places where, like, no, you know what? I'm not going to engage with you. I'm not going to give you the platform. And you have to pick and choose, obviously, but just that idea of the choice and of how to engage with an idea and what that does for your brain and the brains of those around you.
And even for the idea itself, because like you say, you have to, in order to crush the idea, you have to engage with it. And by engaging with it, you are legitimizing it in some way. Sorry, you sent my brain down maybe a slightly different path.
No.
That's what I love about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Ryan, did you have any bits that you wanted to highlight?
There was a conversation that in normal romantic literature, like, this would have frustrated me and upset me. But it's one of those things where it was like, yeah, let's think about this for a minute. And he's having this discussion. I can't remember who he's having a discussion with, but they're talking about what it is that, like, we all experience. And one guy goes off on this rant about pain. Pain is is the universal truth. We all know this. And then a woman's like, no, love is the universal truth. And he's like, no. So it says here, it is our sufferings that bring us together. It is not love. Love does not obey the mind and turns to hate when forced. The bond that binds us is beyond choice. We are brothers. We are brothers in what we share in pain, which each of us must suffer alone, in hunger, in poverty, in hope. We know our brotherhood. We know it because we have had to learn it. We know that there is no help for us but from one another, that no hand will save us if we do not reach out our hand, and the hand that you reach it out is empty as mine is. You have nothing, you possess nothing, you own nothing, you are free. All you have is what you are and what you give. And so that thing for me at the very beginning, I'm a very romantic person when it comes to literature and things. I love the idea that love conquers all and love is the great power. And he's like, so to take this idea and say, no, you don't understand. Your understanding of how to care for another comes from the shared understanding of what it means to have hunger, what it means to be in these scenarios. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this isn't romantic, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong.
It's romantic with a capital R or something. It's not necessarily romantic in the way that we usually use the word now, but it's still, even that idea of pain being the ultimate driver of humanity is a romantic notion in a way.
Yeah, it veers away from the happy. It's not the happy ending drive that we tend to, a lot of times we like, that I enjoy there.
Yeah,
but yeah, I get what you're saying.
Here's an idea for you, Ryan. I want you to now take that idea of it's not love, it's not about love, it's about pain, and go rewatch Interstellar.
Oh yeah.
That would be a cool lens to watch that movie through.
Well,
Go ahead, Mary
can I
Robinette.
just, because that quote goes, that passage goes on, and it's one of, and the next bit of it I think is like, so it's in hunger and poverty and hope we know our brotherhood. We must know it because we have to learn it. We know that there is no help for us but from one another, that no hand will save us if we do not reach out our hand. And the hand that you reach out is empty, as mine is. You have nothing. You possess nothing. You own nothing. You are free. All you have is what you are and what you give. And that's like, yes.
It is an interesting idea. I'm going to noodle on this more, not out loud, because that would lead me to disaster. Okay. But I do like thinking about this, and it actually leads me to something else I wanted to bring up. It's first of all, it's a great line, but it's something that is a recurring theme in this book, and the line is the precursor to this line is the idea that excess is excrement. And that anything that is excess is not worthwhile. It must be ejected. It must we must get rid of it. So he grew up in that kind of society. The excess is excrement idea. And then let's see. He is, where are we? I think he's just gotten down to the surface of the planet. He is in this new bedroom that is, to his eyes, very opulent, kind of the way, Mary Robinette, you were talking about the glass of water. It's what a luxury to have water I don't have to worry about, right? This room was evidently for his sole use, as it opened off the bedroom, talking about the bathroom, I think, and contained only one of each kind of fixture, though each was of a sensuous luxury that far surpassed mere eroticism, and partook, in Shevik's view, of a kind of ultimate apotheosis of the excremental. Oh my gosh, who writes like this? This is such a good line. Anyway, but this idea
of the excremental is the name of my next band.
Oh my gosh. Exactly. But this idea of excess is excrement. But then you can drill down into what does it mean to have excess? What is excess? And it can lead you to some interesting places, also some very dark places. You have those people who say, anybody who lives past the age of 75 has outlived their usefulness and should be killed. Like, there are people who say these things, right? There's that idea that living a long time is excess, So it can lead you to some weird places, but it's again, it's the dial cranked up to 11, and it forces you to kind of think about what is excess as a subjective term. What do I think of as excess, and what is excess to somebody else? To those folks in Behar, their definition of excess would be very different from my definition of excess, right?
There's a little subplot. I don't know if subplot's the right word on that, in her story, that I didn't really, I appreciate, I took some time to read some other thoughts on the piece to help me process things a little bit. And there is a piece in there where I can't remember, the other country is Thu.
Right. The socialist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She kind of writes there's this third entity out there. So we have our...
that we never actually get to go visit, which is almost unfortunate.
Well, because we start out, and at the beginning, you start reading this book, and one of the things is it feels like at the beginning, like, oh, we've set up a dichotomy of this versus this, and that's what it is. But we get this third group in there that if you just take a little bit of time to think about and realize she's actually taken someone who's even further extreme to one side, and we get to see the interaction between those two worlds just a little bit in the war they're fighting over this country. They're like, actually, we don't care about the country itself. It doesn't matter who's running that. It's a power struggle between these two setups. And I think that actually, like, it kind of connects to Le Guin being very, very smart about showing that, as you've talked about, dial up to 11. If these are up to 11, they've ripped the knob off. Thu has ripped the knob off, and so she's saying there's even furthers and dangers to the extremes that these groups have taken. There are these just incredible extremes out there, and this world's even bigger than these three. So there could be extremes in the other direction too. I don't know how you go more extreme than Anaris, but it's possible, I guess.
Yeah, she was writing this in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, and putting a lot of her thoughts about those great power struggles and the proxy wars and that sort of thing into that. So yeah, so I think that's where that came from. But I Mary Robinette, did I cut you off? It looked like you might have been about to say something. If I did, I apologize.
No. I was going to bring up the Vietnam thing as well. This is, she's in direct conversation with Vietnam when she's writing it. I can't remember where I read it, but there's a quote where she's talking about that she was just tired of seemingly endless wars, and that she wasn't sure what sort of that she didn't realize that it was just going to be like that for the rest of her life. She thought, if we protest and things will change. And she's like, oh, apparently no, which is kind of a depressing.
Well, that actually gets to one of the things that that I kept coming back to as I was reading about Anaris, especially, which is human nature. That human nature is a real thing. It exists. It is in the short term, at least. If we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years, maybe this isn't true. But in our lifetimes, it is an immutable fact. Human nature isn't going to change. And so, yeah, her frustration with, what she called endless wars. It's like, yeah, that's kind of that is the state of the world. And, protest though you might, that's not going to change.
Well, and at the same time, I think that's one of the arguments that she's making in this book, is that we have this idea of what human nature is, and that human nature is so shaped by the society that you grew up in. Like right now, I'm reading a different book, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, which is, I highly recommend it.
One of my wife's favorites.
Oh, it's so good. But there's really early in, there's a meditation on strawberries, and how, so for people who, sorry, we were talking about two books simultaneously, but I promise this relates. She's citizen Potawatomi Nation, so Native American, and she talks about how when she was a child that she and her siblings would collect wild strawberries, and that was their birthday gift to their dad every year, and that it was not that the strawberries themselves were not the gift, that the strawberries were from the land, and that the gift was her gift of time and energy, which is a different framing than the way I would have, even though we grew up in overlapping space, we grew up in different nations. And so it is, and different cultural constructs. And that is, I think, the thing that's happening in the Dispossessed is, that his basic human nature for Shevik is, well, I don't possess anything. Like even the language that they use they try to avoid possessive language. And so I think that there are things that we think of as basic human nature that are not actually basic human nature. They're societal constructs.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. There are some fascinating studies out there. And if I can find the links, I'll throw them in the show notes, but no promises. You can go look it up. But there are really interesting studies where people try to get to the core of, of human nature, however defined, the things that every society seems to come to, something as basic as, the fear of dirtiness, something along those lines, where it's like every culture comes to this for obvious reasons. And there's a whole list of them. But as you say, we sometimes ascribe to those lists of what is human nature something that is not. So yeah, it's an interesting question to try to tackle.
Yeah.
Ryan, I want to go a little bit different direction with this and hit you with this one and see what you have to say. The way that I most appreciate explorations of the concepts that we get in this book is not typically in novel format. I really like essays. I like books, nonfiction books exploring these concepts. Because this was in novel format, and because the plot, such as it was so sparse, and like you said earlier, this is basically, it's a series of vignettes. It's him having conversations for the whole book. It's 400 pages of conversation, more or less. It really threw me off. Even as I started to change my expectations around the book, even as I started to try to get on the same page as Le Guin, by the time I was through with it, I still was like, you know what? I really would have liked to have a series of essays where somebody laid this out for me. What about you? Did you, so as interested as I am in the book that she wrote, there's still that little part of me that's like, yeah, but I wish you would have written a different book. What about you? How did you end up feeling about the book in that way?
I think that's
did that
really,
make any sense?
Yeah. I think it's really funny that you say that, because mine is the exact inverse of that, where it was, it was a novel that felt too much like Who Moved My Cheese. In that sense, where I was like, oh, this feels more like a, one of those books where it is written more in essay format, like, because my favorites, my appreciation and explorations of these are in the fiction
Stories.
realm, in the storytelling, because it allows me to put myself in the place of a character and try and empathize and understand maybe a little bit better than just the common version of a lot of those books, where it's, here's a story of how this happened in the office place, and here's how, and you just kind of pull the information from there, and then they summarize it for you anyway a little bit later. Like, I prefer that. This one, it was a little bit harder because I'm not following the narrative quite the same, in the same linear pathway that a lot of stories take. So it was, like I said, it was jarring to hop from essay, mini essay to mini essay to mini essay in the vignettes. So for me, that was one of the struggles I had reading this initially, was dealing with that adjustment to, this doesn't feel like a novel, but it's still, there's enough there that it didn't, like I said, I needed a little bit of help going and processing my thoughts and feelings, because I didn't follow it in that structure, going and looking up information and some other people's thoughts and feelings on it to help me connect dots. Outside of that, though, it was fine.
Mary Robinette, obviously this is one of your favorite books of all time. And so I know that you enjoy the delivery system, or at least I feel comfortable assuming that. But do you have any response to that?
Actually, that my first experience with the book was very similar.
Oh, yeah?
That I was like, but this is a book in which nothing happens. And the thing
which
is,
isn't quite true by the end.
It is,
I mean,
it's definitely not
eventually.
True. It is definitely not true. And also, things are happening. It's just, if you think of conflict as two people having arguments, or taking up arms, if you think of it that way, there's like virtually no conflict through most of the book. If you think about stories as being driven by tension, I think that there's tension all the way through the book.
That's fair.
And because a lot of what he's dealing with is, there's a lot of this book that is a coming of age book, that is him coming to an understanding of himself. I think of it as that at the beginning of a character's story, a character is basically saying, okay, but who am I even? And at the end of the story, a character is going, this is who I am. And this is like classic that. It's not a linear timeline, but I had a very similar reaction, because I was coming, like when I first read it, I was a teen. I'd been a big fan of Wizard of Earthsea. and so I was reading it in the midst of reading, Lord of the Rings, Wizard of Earthsea, lots of Heinlein, because, I was a teen in the 80s.
We should talk about Heinlein. Okay, yeah, go on.
Oh, yeah. I did think about that, and then I'm like, but I would actually like to recommend a book for people that I want them to read now. And then I did a reread of it. I don't remember what prompted me to do the reread of it. I think some of it was that there were images that just stayed in my head. Like there's this image of him and his lover. Crap.
Yeah,
I should have done a really solid reread before this, honestly. But there's this image that just stays in my head of the two of them, and the barren hill and the silver moonlight, and them lying together and talking, and the intimacy of that moment, and also the frustration and the coldness, but that they can have a disagreement that is a profound disagreement, and also that it is not, it doesn't end their relationship. Distance, they separate, they go their own ways, but they remain important to each other, and just there are pieces of it that just kept surfacing in my head. And then when I went back and did a reread, when I was in my 30s, I think there were a number of things that as I was rereading, it was like, oh, this thing that has kind of shaped me was from that book. And I kept hitting lines, was like, oh, I got this from here. Like, one of the ones is, there's a point around the age of 20 when you have to choose whether to be like everybody else in the rest of your life, or to make a virtue of your peculiarities. And I remember making conscious decisions when I was in my 20s and saying to a friend, yeah, I figure everybody winds up being an eccentric when they're old, and I can choose my eccentricities now rather than just having them be random things. I'm like, oh, that's 100% out of the Dispossessed. It's like, oh, that's where that came from. And so that kept happening. So I don't reread it. It's not a comfort read. But it is a book that I think for me is worth like rereading like once a decade. Because my relationship to the book changes as my relationship to the world changes. And that for me, those are the books that excite me, the ones that it's like every time I read it, it is a different book.
Yeah. No, I think the first Le Guin book I ever read 15 years ago or something was Wizard of Earthsea. Hated it. Couldn't stand it. Terrible. Read it a decade later for the podcast, and I was like, oh, this is actually great. This is wonderful. Now that I kind of know what to expect, I ended up really liking it. And this book, don't get me wrong, I did not hate this book. I actually liked this book, but it was very unexpected. And I think I will benefit from a reread. The book, vis-a-vis me, will benefit from a reread. And like you say, maybe, waiting for a little while for a slightly different time in my life will make it hit even harder, or just even differently. Mm-hmm. I think that's going to be, I do look forward to rereading this book at some point. What about you, Ryan?
Yeah, I'm really curious. Here's the thing: I'm really curious as to what would change about my opinion on this book in the future on a reread. Because I went through this, and there's a lot of things, especially looking at my own history of how my opinion has and my feelings have shaped. Very similarly, I can go back to specific moments in literature and media and things like that have given me an idea that has shaped how I view the world and how I do things. I have changed some fairly large points of view in my life in the last 5 years. And I'm curious, reading this now, 10 years down the road, where I've had a little more time to sit and feel and think the way that I do now, what this would read like for me in 10 years. I think it absolutely would hit different for me there. I honestly don't know. Do I have a strong drive to? I'm not sure. I'll be entirely honest. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say no to it. It would be something that would be like, oh yeah, I remember reading that for the Author Shelf episode. I wonder how I'd feel about it now, and just go through it again over, a couple of days.
Yeah. Okay. That's right. I wanted to get back to comparisons between this book and others that I feel like are similar in a way. You brought up Robert Heinlein.
Yeah.
I couldn't stop thinking about Robert Heinlein during this book, not because Robert Heinlein espouses anything close to similar views, but because in a somewhat similar way, Robert Heinlein would use stories as a vehicle, as the delivery system for, here are some ideas, right? And I quite liked Starship Troopers, in part because you don't like everything that you read in it, but boy, does it make you think about stuff, right? He'll bring you questions that you have to grapple with as you go through the story. And the other one that I think is an interesting comparison point would be Ayn Rand. Again, diametrically opposing views in a lot of ways from Ursula Le Guin, but kind of that same thing. Okay, I've got some ideas. I'm tired of writing essays. Here's a novel. In her case, it was this times what 5. It's just she wouldn't shut up about her ideas. But does that make sense?
Yeah.
Where do we feel like this is a fair comparison with those other authors and the way that they're bringing their ideas out, or is this fundamentally different in some way?
I have to admit, I've never read Rand.
That's okay as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think there was an assignment, and I got away with not. At Heinlein, I read. I think I read every Heinlein book, and I have strong opinions about Heinlein, and also would not recommend a Heinlein book. There are other authors you can read that explore these without some of the baggage she comes with. I shouldn't say I would never recommend a Heinlein book, because Stranger in a Strange Land, like if you want to talk about a book that was fundamentally pivotal to me, I read that at exactly the right time in my life. And it is not a book that I would hand to somebody now and say, you should read this, because but it is a book that is exploring some of these same ideas, these ideas of not having possessions, these ideas of having communal living, and the way that disrupts societies when you start to change the rules on people who are really invested in them. Yeah, they definitely explore those ideas. And really, there are very few authors who don't, even the ones who say that they don't.
So I would be very, very interested to see if you took a list of authors like you've done here, and put them, take them in their books and say, was this a message in the form of a story, or a story with a message hidden behind it? Kind of do that and put them on a timeline and what's going on in the world. Because we often say, it's a little bit of a cliche, but we are products of our time, and authors and their works are products of their time. And looking at the time frame that Le Guin writes this, and a lot of people are writing those, they're in a time when having the message needs to be clearer, or there's a lot more things like the Vietnam War, is that you're not going to try and hide your message about Vietnam in 3 layers of story quite to the same level, as you're dealing with that, as you would maybe nowadays, where you've got, there's a little bit of time from and space from that. And authors today they'll write things today based on world now. Can your message be hidden in the story a little more, or does it need to be more upfront because we're dealing with this now and I need my audience to understand this concept now? So just comparing the authors to major life and world events going on around them and seeing if that affects their story to message ratio.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
And what the world expects at that point.
Yeah.
Where the Vietnam War had a sort of immediacy that maybe our contemporary society lacks. In some ways, I mean, in other ways it doesn't. But
Yeah.
yeah,
No.
it would get really messy, but really interesting.
Yeah. Elizabeth Bear said at one point that she thought the difference between a message book, like a book with that was a book that was exploring an idea, and a message book or message story, is that it came down to questions, that that a book that asked questions but didn't seek to answer them was something that was exploring ideas, and that was just a novel. And a book that asked questions and tried to answer them was a message book, and that became a polemic and became uninteresting. And on that level, I do think that Le Guin is asking more questions than she is actually answering. But stylistically, it does feel like a series of essays.
And can get it, depending on where you're coming from, it can feel polemical.
Yeah,
if that's a word. I'm pretty sure that's a word.
I think that is a word. Actually,
we're going to run with it. But it's one of those. If you're on the same wavelength as Le Guin, you're reading this book going, yes, absolutely. And if you're not, you read parts of this book and you're horrified by the ideas she's thrown out there, and it feels more jarring in that way. Well, let's begin wrapping this up. Now, normally when we talk about a book on the Legendarium, we finish by saying, "Hey, do you recommend this book?" But Mary Robinette, I kind of feel like that's a moot point with you. But let me ask you in a slightly more nuanced way: how and when and to whom would you recommend this book?
So this is I would recommend this book for anyone who wants to ask questions of themselves about their place in society, and just to explore ideas. And I think I would recommend this to someone who has time to be contemplative, because it is, there are places where it takes more work than other places.
This is not a Dan Brown page turner.
No, it is. It's a quiet book. It's a contemplative book. It's written in an older style. And I also think that this is a book that you can pick up and set down. This is a book that you can read in between other books. Because, as Ryan noted, that it's a series of vignettes. So I think it's possible to read a chapter of this and then read something else and then come back to this. But for me, anyone who is like, I enjoy asking questions, I enjoy doing self-reflection, that this is a book that I think has some teeth that will nibble at you in ways that you were not expecting it to over the period of time after you finish reading it.
I love it. Ryan, can you better that?
Better it? Absolutely not. But my thing that I would recommend to someone who's reading this is, I think this would be really good. I think it works really well for us because we knew we were coming in to have a discussion as a group. Find a couple people that you could talk to this book. Do a book club on this book. That way you can have your reflective moments and then talk about it and ruin some really good friendships that way.
Perfect.
Absolutely. No, I love what you said, Mary Robinette, earlier about you. Or gosh, I think it was you. Somebody said something about around the age of 20, right?
Yeah. Oh, Ursula Le Guin said that.
Well, right. One of you was talking about. No, but that you read this kind of earlier in your life and then realized how much it had affected you without you understanding it in the moment. College age is a great time of life when people are exploring ideas, and it's more difficult now in the age of social media, but traditionally it's been a time when people can crank their dial up to 11 and see what happens with, if they like certain ways of thinking about the world and whatnot. And this is a great crank it up to 11 book. So if you're around that age, or hey, I'm 36 years old, I'm well past that age, but I still love cranking that dial up. Just especially if it's in a slightly different direction than where I normally go. So I guess that's just another way of saying exactly what you said, Mary Robinette. If you're somebody who enjoys asking those questions, enjoys probing in different directions, then I think it's very recommendable.
Yeah, and also I think, to your point, if you're somebody who's at a phase of life where you're thinking about doing some reinvention of yourself, midlife crisis, pivotal milestone
Now
birthday, this is a book that makes you go, again, with a classic character arc, well, who am I really?
Right.
And depending on how you react to the ideas, it's going to clarify some things for you about who you are.
Yeah, I think that is accurate and a great note to end on for this book. And Mary Robinette, you have been very generous with your time, and I'm really grateful for that. But we can't end without me asking you about your upcoming project that people need to know about. Okay. This is, it's called The Spare Man, and it's coming out on October 11th. Mm-hmm. And I'd love for you to give us a little bit of a kind of an elevator pitch. Tell us what it's about and what people can expect and why we should all pick it up.
So it's a science fiction murder mystery. If you've seen the Thin Man movies with William Powell and Myrna Loy, it is basically the Thin Man in space. Of a happily married couple.
The Thin Man in space.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. That is correct. Happily married couple on their honeymoon with their small dog, solving crimes on an interplanetary cruise ship between the Earth and Mars. There's murder. Every chapter begins with a cocktail recipe. There are 0-proof cocktail recipes for people who prefer their celebratory beverages without alcohol. But yeah, there's witty banter, canoodling, again, small dog. And for those who are worried, I do not kill the small dog because I understand the rules. I do not promise that the small dog is not placed into danger. Her name is Gimlet. She's a service dog.
I think that you should lead with that. There's a dog named Gimlet, and just go read the book, right?
Right. But yeah, basically science fiction murder mystery with some comedy in space and a small dog.
I am sold. Ryan, you and I are both grinning like school children right now because this sounds like so much fun.
Yep. There were so many keywords in that just checked all the boxes for me. Just ding, 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 ding. I'm like, perfect.
That honestly, with that checklist idea, that may be the best elevator pitch any author has given us on the entire run of the Author's Shelf. That is fabulous.
Yeah, because you don't want the plot. You just want to know which pieces of the ride am I getting?
What kind of flavor are you serving up for me here? And I like that.
Yeah.
So it's called The Spare Man.
Uh-huh.
And with that in mind, I hope people will go check it out, pick it up, and let me know if you do. It'd be great to hear about people picking up The Spare Man. And pick up The Dispossessed. Mary Robinette Kowal, thank you so much for picking this book. I say this, I feel like I say this on almost every Author's Shelf episode. One of my favorite things about this series is that it gets me to read books that I wouldn't normally read, that aren't on my radar, that I wouldn't pick up, for not because I don't like them, but because they just aren't on my radar. And I really appreciate you throwing this one our way. It's wonderfully rewarding. So thank you very, very much.
Yeah, I love the premise of this, and you all are delightful conversationalists. So thanks for taking a chance on a book from 1974.
Oh, absolutely. And for those of you listening, thank you so much for listening. We appreciate you doing so. Please go to thelegendarium.com where you can find all the links for all the stuff. The Discord server, which is the friendliest place on the entire internet, I promise. It's wonderful and delightful, and we can converse about this and many other books. You'll also find our link to Patreon. Please support us there if you appreciate what we do on this show. All right, once again, Ryan, thanks for joining, and thanks for reading. Mary Robinette Kowal, thank you so much for picking the book and for being, again, so generous with your time. And I will see you all next time.